The American Civil War was a defining chapter in the history of the United States. It was a terrible conflict that tore the nation apart, pitting brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor. This war took place from 1861 to 1865, a period of 4 long and bloody years. The fighting raged across the vast landscapes of the country, from the farmlands of Pennsylvania to the bayous of Louisiana. It was a war fought not against a foreign enemy, but within the heart of America itself. The United States, a young and promising nation, suddenly found itself on the brink of self-destruction, its very survival hanging precariously in the balance. The roots of this great conflict were deep and complex, growing for decades before the first shots were fired. The most significant cause, the one that overshadowed all others, was the institution of human slavery. In the southern states, the economy was heavily dependent on the labor of enslaved African Americans, who worked on large plantations growing crops like cotton and tobacco. The northern states, on the other hand, had largely abolished slavery and were becoming more industrialized. This fundamental difference in economic and social systems created a profound moral and political divide that seemed impossible to bridge through peaceful compromise. This deep division was further complicated by the fierce debate over states' rights versus the power of the federal government. Many in the South believed that individual states should have the ultimate authority to make their own laws, including laws that protected the institution of slavery. They argued that the federal government in Washington, D.C. had no right to interfere with their way of life. This belief in state sovereignty was a powerful force, leading Southern leaders to feel that their rights were being threatened by the growing anti-slavery sentiment in the North. The tension grew with each passing year, like a gathering storm. The final catalyst came with the presidential election of 1860. The victory of Abraham Lincoln, a candidate from the newly formed Republican Party, was seen as a grave threat by the Southern states. Lincoln and his party were firmly opposed to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Though Lincoln promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, his election was perceived by the South as a clear signal that their political power and their entire social structure were in jeopardy. In response, 7 Southern states, led by South Carolina, decided to leave the Union, an act known as secession, even before Lincoln officially took office. Following the secession of the initial 7 states, 4 more would soon join them to form a new nation. They called themselves the Confederate States of America, or simply the Confederacy. They established their own government, wrote their own constitution which explicitly protected slavery, and elected their own president, a man named Jefferson Davis. Davis was a former United States Senator from Mississippi, and a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He now faced the monumental task of leading a fledgling nation born out of rebellion, a nation that would have to fight for its very existence against the powerful United States, which became known as the Union. The man leading the Union was President Abraham Lincoln. He was a lawyer from Illinois with a deep belief in the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Lincoln viewed the secession of the Southern states not as a legitimate act, but as an illegal rebellion that threatened the very idea of a democratic government. He was determined to preserve the Union at all costs, to prove that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, could endure. His leadership, his words, and his unwavering resolve would guide the nation through its darkest and most trying hours. On the battlefield, 2 great military commanders came to represent the opposing armies. For the Confederacy, that figure was Robert E. Lee. A brilliant and respected officer from Virginia, Lee was initially offered command of the Union Army. However, he could not bring himself to fight against his home state. He chose instead to lead the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Lee became a legendary figure, beloved by his soldiers and feared by his enemies, winning many battles against larger Union forces through his masterful tactics and his deep understanding of military strategy. Facing Lee and the Confederate armies was a succession of Union generals, but the one who would ultimately achieve victory was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was a different kind of commander from Lee. He was not as polished or as revered in the early years of the war, but he possessed an unshakable determination and a relentless will to fight. While other Union generals hesitated, Grant pushed forward, understanding that winning the war required constant pressure and a willingness to sustain heavy losses to achieve the final goal. His tenacity in the Western theater of the war caught Lincoln's attention, and he was eventually brought east to take command of all Union armies. The war began in earnest on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The first major battle, fought at Bull Run in Virginia, was a shocking defeat for the confident but inexperienced Union Army. This early Confederate victory made it clear to everyone that this would not be a short or easy war. For the next 2 years, the fighting intensified, with enormous battles resulting in staggering numbers of casualties. Battles with names like Shiloh, Antietam, and Fredericksburg became etched into the national memory, each one a grim testament to the brutal reality of this internal conflict. The Battle of Antietam, fought in Maryland in September 1862, was the single bloodiest day in American history. Though the battle was technically a draw, it was a strategic victory for the Union because it halted General Lee's first invasion of the North. This victory gave President Lincoln the opportunity he had been waiting for. He issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a historic executive order that declared that all enslaved people in the rebellious Confederate States would be, from that point forward, forever free. This act transformed the purpose of the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union, but also about ending slavery. Perhaps the most famous and pivotal battle of the war was fought in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in July 1863. For 3 days, the Union and Confederate armies clashed in a massive and bloody confrontation. General Lee had invaded the North for a second time, hoping to win a decisive victory that would force the Union to negotiate for peace. The fighting was ferocious, culminating in a disastrous Confederate assault known as Pickett's Charge. The Union Army held its ground and Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia, having suffered devastating losses from which his army would never fully recover. The victory at Gettysburg, combined with General Grant's successful capture of the fortress city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River just 1 day later, marked the great turning point of the war. The Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. The momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the North. Though the fighting would continue for nearly 2 more grueling years, the Confederacy's hopes for victory had been critically damaged. The path to a Union victory, though still long and arduous, was now clear for all to see. After the turning points of 1863, General Grant implemented a strategy of total war. He relentlessly pursued General Lee's army in Virginia, engaging in a series of brutal battles known as the Overland Campaign. At the same time, his trusted general, William Tecumseh Sherman, marched his army through Georgia and the Carolinas, destroying infrastructure and resources that supported the Confederate war effort. This strategy was designed to break not only the Confederate armies but also the will of the Southern people to continue fighting. The war had reached its final, most destructive phase, leaving a wide path of devastation in its wake. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Its armies were depleted, its economy was in ruins, and its people were exhausted. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his beleaguered army to General Ulysses S. Grant at a small courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia. Grant offered generous terms of surrender, allowing the Confederate soldiers to return to their homes in peace. The surrender at Appomattox effectively marked the end of the American Civil War. The nation, battered and scarred, had survived its greatest test. The rebellion was over, and the Union was preserved. The outcomes of the war were monumental and transformed the United States forever. First and foremost, the Union was saved, and the principle that the nation was indivisible was firmly established. Second, the war brought about the abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in late 1865, officially and permanently ended the institution of slavery everywhere in the country. However, this victory came at an almost unimaginable human cost. More than 620,000 soldiers died, more than in all other American wars combined, and countless more were wounded, leaving a legacy of grief that touched nearly every family. The period after the war, known as Reconstruction, was a time of great challenge and change. Efforts were made to rebuild the South and integrate the nearly 4 million newly freed African Americans into the life of the nation as citizens. While the war had settled the questions of Union and slavery, the struggle for true equality had only just begun. The Civil War remains the central event in American history, a violent crucible that redefined the nation and its ideals. Its legacy continues to shape conversations about freedom, justice, and what it means to be an American. reminding us of the high price of our new birth of freedom.